coup leader confirms Prime Minister Chowdhury has suffered a beating. The country's president concedes Mr Chowdhury may have to step down. Supporters to be used as human shields to prevent an assault on the parliament. Israel pulls out of peace talks. And foreigners flee Eritrea. Good evening, I'm Indira Naidu. The leaders of the coup in Fiji appear to have achieved their goal. Despite international support, the Prime Minister's days in office appear to be numbered, regardless of the outcome of the crisis. He and his cabinet colleagues are still being held at gunpoint in the besieged Parliament building. SBS is one of the few networks that's been granted access to the compound in Suva, where today there were some dramatic developments. Prime Minister Mahinda Chowdhury was bashed and dragged onto the parliamentary lawn, where he had a gun held to his head after intruders sparked a security alert. Then Fiji's President Ratu Sirikamasisi Mara refused to guarantee that Chowdhury and his cabinet would be restored to power once the crisis ends. Crucially, Fiji's Great Council of Chiefs will meet tomorrow to consider its response. Coup leader George Speight, who has yet to gain the support of the military, police or judiciary, says he will give up if he fails to get their backing.
Early this morning, a small group of international journalists, including SBS, managed to get inside the parliamentary compound under the control of the armed rebels. We were confined to a small area with no access to the hostages, but independent sources confirmed they were okay.
I'm bringing these supplies. We'll give these messages across. We'll get some fresh ones written to take back again.
Rebel leader George Speight then arrived with an armed guard to speak to us, and he soon launched into a bitter attack on Indian Fijians.
Their social position is they're better than Fijians. Fijian social position is, we think we're better than Indians. We don't worship the same God, we don't eat the same food, we don't smell the same, you name it.
Just moments after this conference, though, there was confusion inside the compound. Armed rebels rushed back and forth as reports came in of an imminent attack.
People climbed over the fences down the bottom perimeter and proceeded to advance up the hill on the backside near the Fijian school, and we went down to apprehend them, and they've since been dispelled back through the gates.
It was during these sorts of panic moments that, away from the cameras, Prime Minister Chowdhury was dragged out onto the lawn, a gun held to his head, and he was bashed. The mood was one of confusion and danger. What is clear is that the fate of the hostages still being held here in the parliamentary compound now depends entirely on the decision being made by the Great Council of Chiefs tomorrow. George Speight says the council, the most influential group in Fiji, will support him when it meets.
Supremely confident that on Tuesday the Great Council of Chiefs will see it fit to endorse and ratify the new direction that we are proposing for the future of our country.
But outside the compound, President Mara was equally firm.
I am also convinced that the Great Council of Chiefs will support me. So we'll see what happens tomorrow.
Then the President dropped the day's biggest bombshell. Even if the coup ends, Mahinda Chowdhury is not guaranteed to get the Prime Ministership back.
I cannot give you that assurance. What I intend to do is to talk to them and say that you've seen what has happened. What is your possible solution for it?
That raises the prospect that the damage done to Fijian society by this coup is already too great, and the Indian-led government can't survive it. That outcome is also being predicted by former coup leader and Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka.
Well, it is a likelihood, a very sad likelihood.
As the day wore on in Suva, George Speight and his fellow rebels were met at Parliament by a crowd of cheering supporters that at one stage swelled into the hundreds. As well as providing a psychological boost for Speight, these people are also a human shield, protecting him from the threat of a military strike.
And a short time ago I spoke to Alan Sunderland and began by asking him about the reports that the coup leader is planning to use those in the parliamentary compound as human shields.
Look, I think he's very serious, Indira. I don't think you can underestimate the amount of paranoia and concern that there is inside that rebel compound. We certainly experienced it today. Now, it has to be said that when you've got the Prime Minister of the country and the daughter of the President, who's one of the MPs, among your political hostages, you don't really need many more human shields for your own protection. But nonetheless, the journalists have been invited in consistently and very aggressively during the day, partly to, of course, spread the message and feed out information, but very much as human shields. And as you say, even his supporters were brought in both to give him moral support, but to provide that extra human shield and to ram home that message that there are civilians, there are international journalists in the compound all day. Don't launch any military strike.
Now, tonight there's some confusion about Ratu Sakamasizi Mara's position in the crisis. How do you interpret his comments that there's no guarantee the Chowdhury government will be reinstated?
Well, I think one has to remember the history of Ratu Sakamasizi Mara. He was, of course, the man who helped to legitimise, if you like, the Rambuka period by recognising and installing him as Prime Minister. I think what we can see here is a game where he's not prepared to go that far this time. He's not prepared to legitimise George Speight. The mood is not for that. But the mood very much politically is for an end to the Fijian Indian dominance and a return to indigenous Fijian power. Ratu Mara has specifically said that he will take measures and proposals to the Great Council of Chiefs tomorrow to enhance the position of indigenous Fijians, and he's said very clearly that part of that may very well mean that Mahendra Chowdhury can no longer be Prime Minister. I think there's some very strong political manoeuvring going on in the background.
And there's a crucial meeting tomorrow of the influential Great Council of Chiefs. Any indication who they'll back?
All the signs at this stage are that they will back the President, Ratu Sakamasizi Mara, and not George Speight. They are, in fact, even as we speak, meeting at the Government House with the President, just informally, before the main meeting tomorrow. But I think that's being seen as a confirmation, if you like, of the general feeling that they will back Mara. But I think what that means is that they will formally recognise and throw their support behind Mara, rather than throwing their support behind Mahendra Chowdhury. And that means the political manoeuvring will continue tomorrow, and we may see some compromises being forced on a reluctant, captive Prime Minister.
So where does this leave Speight then? He's already said that if he can't win the backing of the Chiefs, he'll step down. Do you think that's a likely scenario?
It's too early to predict how he will react to the situation of the Great Council of Chiefs not supporting him. On the one hand, he said that he's all for indigenous Fijian rights and he will support what the Great Council of Chiefs decides. On the other hand, he's hinted that if they don't decide to back him, he may well ask that they prove to him that what they're doing is in the best interest of indigenous Fijians. Now, the conspiracy theorists would say that George Speight is a patsy in all of this, if you like, someone who's set up to take the fall while the real power behind the throne pushes out Chowdhury. I tend to think it's less conspiratorial than that, but I do believe nonetheless that he can't possibly come out of this with full success and with the Prime Ministership. All he can hope to be is some sort of a catalyst for change, and I think if I were him, I'd be very worried about my own personal future.
Alan Sunderland in Suva, many thanks. As America advises its citizens to steer clear of Fiji, there are growing fears about the effect on the country's tourist industry. A number of tourists have cancelled their holiday, and a scheduled flight has been unable to take off because of the curfew. Meanwhile, in a bid to shore up the country's economy, the central bank has introduced drastic financial controls to prevent money from flowing out of the country. Here, the Fijian High Commissioner has warned the Australian government not to intervene in the crisis for fear of arousing nationalist support for the rebels. And from Vietnam, the Foreign Minister has pointedly backed down from demanding the reinstatement of Prime Minister Chowdhury. The news will come as a disappointment to other influential Fijians here who say Australia must uphold the democratically elected government.
Andy Queenie Speed is no stranger to coups. Her late husband, Dr Timothy Bavandra, was ousted by the military in 1987. Now Deputy Prime Minister in the Chowdhury government, she's in a Canberra hospital fighting a personal battle with cancer. But as a High Chief, Andy Queenie is appealing to fellow members of Fiji's Great Council of Chiefs not to back the coup.
If they win this time, we are passing on to future generations a legacy of instability and moral bankruptcy.
Fiji's representative in Canberra is also relying on the leadership of Fiji's traditional leaders.
Whether we take the extreme path or whether we take the middle ground, because that's really what will decide Fiji's future.
The High Commissioner, also a Ratu or chief, says a decision in favour of those mounting the coup could see him step aside.
Yeah, I would consider it.
His main concern, to prevent bloodshed, is shared by Fiji's Education Minister, who was out of the country when the coup was launched. He'll hold discussions with Foreign Minister Alexander Downer in Canberra tomorrow, and he'll stress that any Australian intervention should be extremely low-key.
An independent person from the government, maybe the High Commissioner or some, to visit the Prime Minister and then other cabinet members.
Any direct intervention, it seems, could arouse nationalist fervour and force the chiefs to support the plotters.
You really can't jump in. At the moment, there's no clear picture has emerged.
There's no question that Fiji's fragile economy will suffer, whatever the outcome.
Fiji's economy relies on cooperation between Indo-Fijians and the indigenous Fijians.
This has put it 50 years or so back.
Overseas investors and tourists understandably nervous about a country ready to resort to the gun to resolve its political problems.
To other news now, and the Israeli government has denied that it's planning to bring forward its withdrawal from southern Lebanon. But the days of occupation are coming to an end. Today, Israeli soldiers withdrew from a key base, leaving their allies in the South Lebanon army to the fate of Hezbollah guerrillas. The developments come as Prime Minister Barak pulls out of talks with the Palestinians, following more protests in which a young girl was seriously injured.
As pressure mounts for an official early withdrawal from southern Lebanon, units of Israel's proxy army, the SLA, are already turning their backs on key positions, leaving the occupied area behind. In the last few hours, Hezbollah guerrillas have moved into towns abandoned by the SLA, and hundreds of so-called collaborators have been taken away. The hemorrhage of the SLA comes in the wake of Israel's suspension of parallel peace talks with the Palestinians in Sweden. Ehud Barak called for a halt to the meetings after protests demanding the release of Palestinian prisoners left a 2-year-old Israeli girl with severe burns. A spokesman laid the blame on the Palestinian president.
If President Arafat cannot control them, or worse, that he allowed to do so, all the negotiation between us and Chairman Arafat is under a big question mark.
But Palestinian negotiator Saab Erekat, here berated by a girl whose father is imprisoned in Israel, blames Barak's refusal to release detainees for the breakdown.
We really urge the Israeli side to expedite the measures concerning the release of prisoners in order to remove the causes that led to the situation on the street, the escalation on the street.
Hezbollah chiefs want Israel to release prisoners and say the withdrawal from the occupied territories will be no withdrawal without the gesture. The 5th Palestinian killed by Israeli troops in the past week has been buried, but for the first time there's been a heavy Palestinian police presence. Beefing up security has been a key Israeli demand. It could be enough to get the two sides talking again.
The Norwegian Foreign Minister has arrived in Sri Lanka to try and convince the government to meet with Tamil Tiger rebels amidst escalating violence in the north. More and more refugees are fleeing to India after witnessing hand-to-hand fighting around Jaffna. The Sri Lankan government has reiterated it won't surrender the northern peninsula to the rebels who want their own separate state. Diplomatic moves are underway to end the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The European Union has sent an envoy to Eritrea, while negotiators from the Organisation of African Unity and Libya have arrived in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. The moves come as the United States evacuates foreign nationals from Eritrea. Tonight, Eritrean forces claim to have killed nearly 200 enemy soldiers in an area Ethiopia had claimed to control. Ethiopian troops say they are within 100 kilometres of the Eritrean capital after capturing the military compound town of Barentu.
An advancing Ethiopian army continues to bombard the enemy on its own soil, forcing Eritrean soldiers to retreat in the now 9-day-old border dispute. Abandoned tanks and stacks of ammunition, burnt-out trucks and charred soldiers' bodies, all signs that Ethiopia is winning. Eritrean soldiers have been captured along with their Western Military Command town of Barantu. Ethiopia now controlling territory less than 100 kilometres from Eritrea's capital, Asmara. Despite reportedly disastrous casualty figures, truckloads of young Eritrean students are rushing to defend their country.
Right now, at this moment, my country is invaded by Ethiopia, and we all, Asmara University students, we are ready to fight against this Ethiopia's aggression.
Thousands of women and children have taken to the streets demanding an end to the invasion. But with Ethiopia ignoring United Nations calls to reopen peace talks, the United States has begun evacuating its embassy staff and other foreigners from the capital. It's a move that aid agencies fear will trigger a general foreign pullout.
I think the biggest thing that we feel is that there's been absolutely no support for this country internationally.
An exodus of relief workers will scuttle desperately needed aid projects for hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the fighting. Already 500,000 Eritreans are on the move, many seeking shelter in neighbouring Sudan.
More than 50 UN personnel being held hostage by rebels in Sierra Leone have been freed. Their release comes as the Sierra Leone army repelled what it said was a rebel attack on the front line. Thousands of extra UN troops are on their way to the country for peacekeeping duties. Around 270 of their colleagues are still being held by the rebel Revolutionary United Front, which is demanding the release of their leader, Fidei Sanko. After years of staunchly defending their independence, Swiss voters have strongly backed closer trade ties with the European Union. Although still officially outside the EU, the new measures will allow the free flow of labour and goods in both directions across the Alps. But in Italy, a raft of referendums on electoral reform have been defeated. Measures aimed at more stable government have failed, even to attract enough voters to validate the poll.
The merging of European countries into one economic entity has left neutral Switzerland in a quandary. While the Swiss remain suspicious of ceding power to the European Union, they also fear being left behind by the economic powerhouses on their doorstep. 8 years ago, voters rejected proposals for a loose economic free trade pact. That prompted the government to develop the complex bilateral EU accords that were put to the public at the weekend. The referendum was forced by an alliance of nationalist and green groups, which fear a flood of cheap labour and heavy trucks over the Alps. But economic common sense won the day. More than 60% of Swiss exports are sold to EU countries, which in turn provide 80% of its imports. The accords on labour, transport and agriculture were backed in the end by all but 2 of 24 states and 2/3 of the voters who took part. Italian voters grappled with a series of referendums over the weekend, 7 in all, but with far less enthusiasm. The key proposals would have scrapped proportional representation, which gives minority parties a quarter of the parliamentary seats. It's considered the main reason why Italy has had 58 governments since the Second World War. Barely 30% of Italians bothered to take part, rendering the expensive exercise invalid. But that could be a reflection of the lack of political interest in electoral reform. Only 6 of Italy's 41 political groups had called for a yes vote.
The Caribbean nation of Haiti seems set to return to democratic rule following a high voter turnout at elections that passed relatively peacefully. Voting was extended by an hour after a slow start in some areas. Security was tight following a violent lead-up to the poll. With staff shortages adding to the delays, long queues formed outside polling stations. Apart from a lone gunman's shootout with police, observers report no significant trouble. Officials estimate that 60% of voters took part. The poll comes a year after President René Préval disbanded Parliament and appointed a new Prime Minister by decree. It's hoped a return to democracy will also free up more than $800 million in foreign aid. It's been another bad day for the Australian dollar. The currency dropped below 57 US cents after the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Ian Macfarlane, indicated that interest rates might have peaked. But Mr Macfarlane told a federal parliamentary committee that any increase in inflation would trigger a further tightening of monetary policy.
A further decline in the value of the dollar is not what the Governor of the Reserve Bank had hoped to achieve when he appeared at a hearing of the House of Representatives Economics Committee. Mr Macfarlane predicts that Australia's economy will continue to grow with inflation remaining between 2 and 3% over the next 18 months.
Adjustments to monetary policy which have been made over the past 6 or 7 months give us more confidence that inflation should be contained.
It's good news for home loan borrowers, the Reserve indicating that it's not planning another interest rate hike in June after 4 previous rises totaling 1.25%. But a freeze on interest rates is turning away international investors, making the Aussie dollar less attractive. It has fallen below 57 US cents, less than 2 cents of its all-time low of 55.30. And the currency has an image problem, say analysts.
Earlier in the year we heard the story that the Australian dollar was an older economy and stuck with commodities and so forth, and now we actually see some of those commodity prices rising. So it suggests to us that going forward the Australian dollar represents good value. Now in the short term it may continue to weaken, particularly if the US dollar remains strong.
That's not likely to change in the near future, but as in Australia, there are indications that recent rate rises in the US are dampening consumer demand.
The continued uncertainty both here and in the United States has seen the Australian share market fall more than 1%. And last week's heavy stock market falls in the US contributed to a 3% plunge in Tokyo's Nikkei today. A short time ago in London, the FTSE 100 was up 25 points and the Australian dollar was weaker against all the major currencies. The Australian who led the international peacekeeping force in Cambodia, Lieutenant General John Sanderson, has been appointed Governor of Western Australia. General Sanderson, who was born in the West Australian port town of Geraldton, retired as Chief of the Army in 1989. The Olympic torch has arrived on Guam to begin its journey across Oceania. Guam is the first of 13 Pacific countries to host the torch before it reaches Australia next month. The event brought the island nation to a standstill. Outrigger canoes carried the torch for part of today's relay. Enthusiastic bearers then carried it ashore to a beach party. One of the greatest British actors of all time, Sir John Gielgud, has died at the age of 96. With his silken voice, he made a renowned Shakespearean actor. His Hamlet had no rival. It was a part he played more than 500 times. Late in life, he tackled comedy on the big screen in Arthur and won an Academy Award for it. He continued to act right till the end. And the literary world is tonight mourning the death of Dame Barbara Cartland, one of the most colourful and prolific authors ever. The woman who sold more than 1 billion books to become the world's best-selling author has died in her sleep at the age of 98. Her novels were full of true love and happy endings. Known for her endless wardrobe of flowing pink gowns, she penned a book every 2 weeks, selling more than 750 million worldwide. In 1981, real life imitated one of her plots when her step-granddaughter, Lady Diana Spencer, married into the British royal family. Tomorrow's weather now. Brisbane, showers 23, Sydney fine 21, Canberra also fine 15, Hobart mainly fine 17, a fine day for Melbourne 16, Adelaide 17, Perth 23 and Darwin 32. In our region, Beijing 28, Jakarta 32, Kuala Lumpur 34, Manila 31 and Seoul 23. And around the world, Beirut 24, Buenos Aires 17, Istanbul 25, Johannesburg 18 and New York 13. And just before we go, a recap of the day's top story. The coup attempt in Fiji appears to have achieved its goal. President Ratu Sirikamasisi Mara today refused to guarantee that Prime Minister Mahendri Chaudhry and his cabinet would be restored to power once the crisis ends. It's an ominous backdrop to tomorrow's crucial meeting of the Council of Chiefs, Fiji's most senior political body. Coup leader George Speight has promised to release all of his hostages if he fails to win the chief's backing. And that's the World News tonight. I'm Indira Naidu. Have a good night. Good night.
The same God, we don't eat the same food, we don't smell the same.